Boldwood presents A Mother's War, written by Helen Parusel and read by Karen Cass. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Part 1. Chapter 1. Narvik, Norway, 9th of April 1940. 220 kilometres inside the Arctic Circle. The sounds of the fjord were different that night. Laila lay in bed listening. A faint drone beneath the whine of the wind, a low hum from the churning sea. She heard a shout. Her body stiffened. More shouts. She kicked back her eiderdown and swung her feet onto the wooden floor. Her long white nightdress twisted around her ankles as she darted to the window. Ice and snow covered the glass. She pulled at the window, but the old frame jammed. A jiggle and a yank, she forced it open. Raw air gushed in and covered her face in a cold mist. Through the swirl of snowflakes, she saw a mass of grey-black silhouettes hulking across the fjord. People with torches and binoculars were gathered along the shore. A man pointed and the crowd ran from the water's edge. Laila gripped the windowsill, digging her nails into the splintered paint. Her eyes searched the darkness. A deep roar erupted and echoed across the fjord. A shape on the water exploded and flames split open the night sky, illuminating the scene. Battleships. Rows of them. Battleships looming over the fishing boats that leapt and rolled in the storm beneath the snow-tipped mountains. She watched, transfixed, unable to move or think until her bedroom door flew open. Mama, small and grey, stood in the doorway, the neck of her nightdress clutched in her hands. Her voice shook. "My God, what's happening?" As Laila reached for her, a blast shook the house. Vibrations shuddered through her body. She swung back to the window. Nearby houses crackled orange, dense black smoke spiraled above. Horrified, she saw the Anderson family topple out the front door of their burning home. Laila froze. Heartbeats passed. Something inside her shifted, and adrenaline ignited. Papa wasn't here. She must act, get the family to safety. She strode over to her mother and grabbed her shoulders. "Mama, we have to leave. Now." Light, swift footsteps. Olaf in his red pyjamas. "Is it the Germans? Are they here? Or have the British come?" "I don't know. We must get out of here." Hannah ran in with their baby sister cradled in her arms. "Get dressed, everyone," Laila said. "Quickly, your warmest clothes. We'll meet in the kitchen. Hurry." Laila took baby Inga from Hannah and propelled the family down the hall. She tore off her nightdress, climbed into ski pants, and swathed the baby in blankets, hugging her against her chest. She rushed down the narrow stairs. With the family now dressed and gathered in the kitchen, Hannah glared at Laila. "We can't just leave," she said. "That's crazy. Where should we go?" "We'll go to Aunt Kirsten. It'll be safer away from the coast." "But Papa took the car." "We'll walk." "No, it's too far. We should go to the cellar and wait for Papa." "And wait till the house collapses on top of us?" Laila turned to her mother and clasped her hands. "Are you strong enough to walk, Mama? Could you?" "Of course she's not," snapped Hannah. "She's still recovering from—" A flash of light, the earth trembled, the window shattered, and their 6 blue coffee mugs tumbled from the shelf and smashed onto the floor. The family stumbled into the hall, plucking coats and scarves from hooks on the wall, and Laila took her father's torch. Then she grabbed some paper and a pen from the commode and scribbled a note. The lamp, with the beige-fringed shade, lay on the floor. Mama gazed at it a moment, picked it up, and placed it back on top of the commode. Moments later, they stepped out into a blizzard of snow and ash. Laila's throat burned from the smoke. Her eyes watered. A blur of images swirled around her. People ploughing through the freshly fallen snow, small children in their arms, or pulling sledges bearing elderly and infirm relatives. The timber houses aflame, the wind flinging snowflakes and burning embers into tornadoes of black speckled with white. Worst of all was the noise, the boom of the explosions and the staccato of gunfire that bounced between the mountains. But the most terrifying sound was the wail of men, which the wind tossed through the air from the sea. The caravan of bundled figures trudged through the snow, stooped against the storm. Ahead of Laila, a small child flung over a man's shoulder dropped a doll which had been dangling from one mittened hand. The child wailed as the father, busy shouting instructions to the rest of his family, strode on. Laila, clutching Inga tight, bent down and scooped the doll from the snow, and stomped as fast as she could after the child. Laila's breaths came in short, painful, smoke-filled gasps. Coming up behind the father, she held up the doll to the child's outstretched arms. The child choked back a last sob, clutched the doll with both hands, and gazed at Laila as she and her father headed on. Laila turned back to her own family. At a crossroads outside of town, the caravan split up in different directions. Laila and her family departed along a narrow, winding country road. They were on their own. Away from the blaze of the port, the path darkened, and Laila flicked on the torch. The note she had left said they were on their way to Aunt Kirsten. Maybe Papa had already seen it and was on his way with the car. Headlights would appear behind them, and they would all pile in with relief at being with Papa again. Safe. But they heard no engine. They saw no lights. Laila led the way, baby Inga in the crook of her left arm and the torch in her right hand, swaying the beam from side to side, keeping them on the snow-entrenched road that wound between the trees. They followed the small circle of light, a pinprick amid the towering pines that amassed like implacable guards alongside them. "Stop!" Laila turned at her sister's shout. Mama had dropped to her knees in the snow, her arms still linked to Hanna on one side and Olaf on the other. Laila stamped back, treading through her own footprints, watching her siblings try to hoist Mama back to her feet, but her limp body sagged between them. Fear twisted in Laila's belly, fear as cold as the Arctic wind that whipped around them in circles. Had she made a terrible mistake, leading her sick mother into the freezing night? Her impulse had been for the family to flee the flames. What if her mother died here? "Mama, Mama!" Laila balanced Inga on her hip, and with her free hand helped to hoist Mama, then dragged her to a fallen tree trunk beside the road. With a sweep of her arm, Hanna cleared the snow and they lowered their mother onto the log. Laila shone the torch on Mama's face. Her skin was translucent, her frosted lips purple-blue. Snowflakes clung to her closed eyelashes. The children called her name again and again, but she didn't reply. They rubbed her hands, her arms, her face. Olaf screamed his mother was dead. But no, they could see her wisps of breath. "Mama, please," Laila said through numb lips. She massaged her mother's chest. They couldn't lose Mama. Mama, who knitted Selbu rose pullovers, baked pannekaken with blueberries and spoke of mystical folk tales, trolls and huldra. Mama moaned, her eyes fluttering open. "Please, a short rest, please." In the sallow torchlight, Laila saw Hanna's hard, accusing stare. Laila looked away and upwards. The sky had cleared and a half-moon cast a watery, silvery glow on the shifting snow. It was Anton who should have been here to make the decisions. Pain jabbed at her heart. How she missed her elder brother. When Mama could stand again, they continued their journey. Laila focused on counting her steps, her boots scrunching hollows in the snow. She liked the soothing rhythm of counting, one step then another. She and Hanna, their arms under Mama's shoulders. Olaf carrying Inga, who cried and whimpered and slept. "Nearly there," repeated Laila over and over again. "Nearly there." The torchlight dimmed and flickered. It flickered again, and was gone. Laila halted and shook the torch, beat it against the palm of her hand, then flung it to the ground. Darkness. Hanna cried out. Laila strained her eyes, making out the jagged outlines of mountains, backlit by the palest glow. "We'll make it. The sun is rising." Aunt Kirsten flew out the door in her dressing gown, her slippers disappearing into the soft snow. Thank God you're here. Uncle has been listening to the BBC. Then, reaching for her sister, Astrid, let's get you inside. Where is Ivar? Papa drove to see Grandpa yesterday, but we haven't heard from them, answered Laila. Aunt Kirsten ushered them into the sitting room, lit the fire, and served steaming fish soup, whilst Uncle twirled the dials of his radio, searching for the latest news. Late morning, Laila heard the rumble of a car motor and the crunch of snow. Everyone rushed to the front door, and there stood Papa with Grandpa. Screams of delight followed, then hugs and tears. Laila was weak with relief to have the family reunited. No one left the farmhouse for 5 days. What started as a hum soon became a roar as each day planes flew overhead. The family huddled around Uncle's radio, desperate for news. BBC London announced that Norway, a neutral country, had been invaded by Germany. Local radio, now under German control, instructed Norwegians to carry on their normal lives and continue working. They had nothing to fear if the German rules were obeyed. Our normal lives? Laila was bewildered. Nothing about their lives was normal now. Papa decided to drive into Narvik to see what was going on, praying their house was still standing. He was also anxious to see if the sardine factory he managed had been hit. Laila and Hannah begged to accompany him, desperate to know what had happened to their home, their friends and neighbours. At first he said it was too dangerous, but then relented. The three of them set off on a sunny, cool morning, waving limply to the rest of the family gathered on the doorstep. They saw the first soldiers at a roadblock to the town. They wore long grey-green belted coats and round helmets, and carried rifles strung over their shoulders on brown leather straps. A soldier raised his arm in a gesture for them to stop. He approached the car, and Laila watched his rifle swing as Papa wound down the window. Ausweis bitte. The soldier held out his hand. Laila's father rummaged around in his coat pocket for his papers. The soldier studied the documents and peered into the car, his gaze flitting between the sisters. Did his glance at Hannah linger a moment too long? Laila's chest tightened. He was young, about the same age Anton had been. The soldier waved them through. He allowed them to pass. How dare this invader order them around in their own land? What right did he have? As they drove through Narvik, Laila gaped out the window. Smouldering buildings, houses turned to charcoal, and rubbles of stone piled along the roadside. The air was laden with grey-black ash. Soldiers stood on patrol or marched the streets, their stiff legs encased in long black boots. Laila's eyes swam with tears. She didn't recognise this place. They passed the town hall, where, above the entrance, a blood-red flag cracked in the wind, the black swastika leering out at her. Bile rose in her throat. Her world tilted. Everything she'd known and understood had crumbled, the ruins of a life reflected in the debris that surrounded her. As they approached the harbour, the carnage spread before them. Burned-out boats and debris from supply ships littered the water. A partly submerged destroyer lay flipped on its side like the dead pilot whale Laila had seen last winter. They rounded the fjord and headed towards home. The mountains soared from the navy sea, crags of bare rock jutting through the snow. These mountains that Grandpa said were trolls that had turned to stone. These mountains, Laila's mountains, now brooded at the destruction below. The trolls were watching. Papa slowed the car. Close to the water, the ruins of their neighbours' houses stood like blackened skeletons, their disjointed limbs naked in bizarre poses. Laila could hardly bear to look out the window. Then she saw a house still standing, and another. She held her breath. And there stood their 2-story green wooden home. Thank God, Laila murmured to herself. The house was blackened, the windows shattered, but the structure appeared intact. It looked tired but defiant, worn but strong. Laila was overcome by the pull of the emotional bond she felt with her home, as if it were the core of her existence. Her father parked, and they all climbed out. Laila took a deep breath, but instead of tasting sea salt on her tongue, it was ash. She looked at the rowan tree that stood guard over their home, its bark and branches singed. The rowan tree they always danced around on Midsummer's Eve, the girls wearing garlands of flowers in their hair. Would the branches sprout feathery leaves this spring? Would they bear blood-red berries in autumn? Papa pushed open the front door and they entered, taking in the chaos, splintered glass and ash-smeared walls. Laila hauled out the cleaning supplies, and they set to work. Chapter 2. May to July 1940. Laila and her father pulled up in his black Volvo outside the Hotel Nordic, where Laila worked. Over the entrance, the German flag whipped back and forth in the wind. Laila wondered what fate had met the Norwegian flag that had flown outside the building for the last 30 years. She turned to face Papa as he switched off the engine. As always, he wore a hat and a three-piece suit with matching waistcoat, today with a white shirt that Laila had ironed that morning.
Take care, Laila. If the sirens sound, go to the hotel cellar immediately.
Papa, I don't want to work for the Germans. Maybe I'll quit and find work elsewhere.
You can't leave without serious repercussions. And where would you find a job? The Germans are controlling all businesses now. Keep your head down and try to carry on as normal.
Normal. That absurd word again. She kissed him on his cheek. Have a good day, Papa. She climbed out and hurried up the steps, rummaging for her pass in her handbag. It was an outrage to have to show the soldier on duty identity papers in her country. She determined not to look at him. When he said, "Guten Morgen," far too politely, she stared at a point above his round helmet. It looked like her mother's cake-mixing bowl. Her fingers trembled as she held out her pass, and a gust of wind whipped it from her grasp. The soldier sprang after it and returned it to her. She was forced to look at him. Dark eyes, thick lashes. He gave her a gentle smile. Did he expect a thank you? She said nothing, and shoving her pass back in her bag, she swept past him. There was a lot to do today. She had to ensure that the 30 rooms were clean and ready for the German officers arriving that afternoon. All the other guests had been ordered to leave. The hotel had been requisitioned as quarters for the German Wehrmacht. Laila and the housekeeper, Sigrid, surveyed each room, checking under the beds for dust and the bathroom for clean towels. Sigrid muttered and shook her head. She had worked there for 20 years. How could such a thing happen, here, in Norway? Everyone had heard what had happened in Poland, of course, but here? And to think that the king and the royal family were forced to flee the palace in Oslo. Laila straightened the curtains, looked towards the bedroom door, and lowered her voice. It won't last. Our troops are gathering, and people are joining the resistance. And the British will help. Help? From the British? How does it help, bombing Narvik to smithereens and killing us all off? Laila had no answer. Her stomach had been churning all morning in anticipation of the arriving officers. She had one final task to perform, organising the staff to fit blackout blinds on all the windows. The German command had been specific about this regulation. At lunchtime, she took a short break and walked around the block. The air was so thick with grime she could taste it. Rubble littered what remained of the pavement. A woman and a young boy were heaving debris with their bare hands into a wheelbarrow. Laila stopped beside them and, giving them a weak smile, lifted some stones too. They worked in silence for a short while before Laila nodded goodbye and headed back towards the hotel. As she turned the street corner, she saw a German soldier addressing 3 children. A girl was wiping tears from her eyes, and the 2 older boys stood solemnly staring at their shoes. Laila gritted her teeth. A German harassing children. Despicable. Striding towards the group, she saw it was the same soldier who had retrieved her pass that morning. In her best school German, she said, "What are you doing to these children?" She hated the tremor in her voice. That she was afraid. He looked surprised.
Nothing,
What's the problem here? Said Laila, addressing the children in Norwegian. The girl spoke up.
The boys were trying to take the sweets a German soldier gave me earlier. They got some too, but they want mine as well, and that's not fair because they're mine.
Yeah, but you got more than us, the taller boy said.
I did not. The girl stamped her foot. Anyway, this soldier saw the boys pushing me around and stopped them.
Laila looked at the soldier, whose bewildered expression told her he didn't speak Norwegian. Surprise took the place of her anger.
So you are trying to help out here?
Said Laila in German. Yes, he said, digging out a handful of sweets from his trouser pocket. I have enough for everyone. He divided the sweets, placed them in the children's upturned palms, and waved them off. Laila watched them scamper away with mixed emotions. Buying favour with a few sweets didn't seem right somehow, but at least he hadn't been threatening the children. Let me introduce myself. My name is Private Josef Schultz. We met this morning. She was speechless. He spoke as if they were meeting at a dinner party, not as an aggressor she had to show her papers to. In the absence of knowing what else to say, she replied, I'm Miss Laila Olsen, the reception manager. To her horror, she felt a flush creep up her throat. Pleased to meet you, he said formally. This was too ridiculous. Laila nodded, saying she must get back to work, and then walked on. Later that afternoon, Laila heard a commotion outside the hotel, a rumble of car engines, orders barked in German, the opening and closing of car doors, and the trample of boots on the hotel steps. The manager ran out of his office, buttoning up his jacket. Call the staff, Laila, quick! Everyone has been ordered to welcome the officers. Welcome? Laila chewed the inside of her cheek. She snatched a couple of breaths to calm herself and rang the small brass bell on the reception desk. Staff bustled into the entrance hall, and the manager ushered them into 2 lines on each side of the entrance. Laila stood with the manager and the housekeeper at the top of the steps outside. The officers were wearing crisp, new uniforms, jackets adorned with coloured stripes and metal pins, and riding pants ballooning over tops of boots polished to an impossible shine. Laila was not sure if the nausea she felt was fear or revulsion. An officer shook the manager's hand, and the Germans were led inside past the waiting employees. The soldiers nodded in greeting. Some even smiled. For a wild moment, Laila had the urge to turn her back on the soldiers. She had heard stories of villagers in the south of Norway lining the streets, their backs to the incoming army. But she did not turn. She would find other ways of defiance. Her cheeks flamed as they passed by, but she met their eye. The manager called Laila to his office, where he introduced her to Herr Major Hass. The officer was broad from his chest to his forehead. This is my assistant, Miss Laila Olsen, the manager said. She will make sure you and the other officers have everything you require. Guten Tag, Fräulein Olsen, said Major Haas. Fräulein, how she hated the sound of her name from his thick lips. She gave a curt reply. The manager glowered at her, willing her to offer more than a good afternoon, but she remained silent. The major's smile dropped, and he gave a sharp nod as dismissal. As she left the office, she noticed sweat had pooled under her armpits, dampening her grey wool dress. At 5 o'clock, she collected her coat and left the hotel. Josef Schultz stood at the entrance. In spite of herself, she glanced at him. He wished her a good evening. Bizarre under the circumstances. She didn't reply. Why did he have to be so damn polite? Her father was parked outside. They would pick up Hannah from where she worked at the tailor's shop and drive back to the countryside where they were still living with Aunt Kirsten. Papa, when can we return home? It's been a month now, she said as they drove off. It's not safe yet. With the continual air raids from the British, it terrifies me enough that the Germans insist you work. At least you're safe at night. How long will it take to drive the Germans out? What will happen to us all if they stay? But Papa just shook his head, murmuring he didn't know. They drove in silence. Traffic had increased in Narvik. Laila watched military trucks trundle by, motorbikes speed past, those with ridiculous sidecars that the Germans were so fond of. Soldiers patrolled on huge, intimidating horses that had been brought by ship. After a while, Papa said,
"What's the matter with you and Hannah? You barely speak to each other anymore."
"Hannah's angry that I made us leave the house. She says I risked Mama's life when she is so fragile. Did I make the right decision?"
"You did fine, Laila. You're a sensible girl, reliable, you always were."
His voice trailed off as he became distracted by the sight of a tank which dwarfed them as it passed by. Eventually they pulled up outside the tailor's shop and waited for Hannah. She appeared, nudging the door open with her foot as she struggled with a large white box. The dresses. Laila felt a wave of affection for her sister and determined to try to get on better with her. After a supper of fish dumplings, swedes, and carrots, the family retired to the sitting room, whilst Hannah stayed in the kitchen working at her aunt's sewing machine. Laila watched her from the doorway. She was intent on her work, feeding the fabric expertly under the needle. Her hair, dark and wavy like their father's, had fallen forward over the left side of her face. She was a pretty girl, as everyone said, and at the age of 16 had a fuller, rounder figure than Laila. She looked like a woman, thought Laila, wincing at the thought of her own flat chest. Hannah didn't hear her approach over the clack-clack of the machine. "It's beautiful," said Laila, appraising the bunad Hannah was working on. "I promised you it would be finished for the National Day celebrations," said Hannah, looking up. "Of course, when I started, we couldn't imagine how life would change. I'm going to finish it anyway." She slipped the material out of the machine and handed it to Laila, who held the dress against her. It was royal blue wool, buttoned to a fitted waist and had a full pleated skirt. She would wear it with a white puffed sleeve blouse and the apron embroidered by her grandmother. "They may forbid the celebrations, but they can't forbid me from wearing my new dress. You're so talented, Hannah, thank you." Laila leaned down and placed a kiss on her sister's cheek. Seeing her surprise, Laila said, "I'm sorry things have been so difficult between us. We're all under such strain. Can we try to get on better? We need to stick together as a family." Hannah smiled and stood up, opening her arms. "You're right, family is important." "Family is everything," said Laila. As they embraced, the tightness in Laila's chest softened. Perhaps things would improve between them. When Laila and Hannah left the house the next morning, their father had just finished washing and polishing the car. He stood back proudly, inviting comment. "How grand we will look arriving in Narvik, Papa," said Hannah. "You must have been up early," said Laila.
"I couldn't sleep. Hop in, my princesses."
The three drove off in a brief lightness of mood. First, Papa dropped Hannah off at the tailor's shop and then drove Laila to the hotel. "Papa, what is happening with the resistance? Surely we must do something too."
"There is a movement growing," he replied. "Be patient. But your priority is to keep safe. Don't antagonize the Germans. Leave resistance to others. Obey the rules."
Her jaw tightened. Obey the rules. She would follow Papa's advice. On the surface, but she could not remain passive. She would find out more about this resistance movement. As she climbed out of the car, she saw Major Haas at the top of the stairs, his brown briefcase clutched under his arm, talking to Josef.Josef. Haas studied her as she climbed the steps, and then stared after her father as he drove off.
"Who brought you to work, Fräulein Olsen?" he asked.
"My father," she said as politely as she could.
"Nice auto."
His thick lips attempted a smile, but the result was a bizarre grimace. When they got home, Uncle was twirling dials on his radio. "Is there news?" Laila asked.
"King Haakon has sent out an appeal from hiding, telling Norwegians to join their local forces and retaliate. Our young men are gathering in the mountains, preparing for battle."
"Can we win? We must win. It can't go on like this." Laila looked at her father.
He sighed. "We don't have the military equipment the Germans have, but we know these mountains and the Germans underestimate us. I pray we have a chance."
You won't fight, will you? Please don't think about fighting.
Laila grabbed his hand. He gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes but said nothing. That night, Laila lay awake for hours. How could this be happening? Norway was a peace-loving nation. It had remained neutral in World War I. They didn't want to be involved in any of it. It was so unfair. She cringed at her own childishness. She sounded like Olaf. The king had called on the people to fight. Would her father join up? She felt a chill. What if he never came back? Much later, she drifted into a sleep where blackened buildings were silhouetted against the dust sky, shrouding the fjord, where soldiers marched and hung their alien flags on buildings that didn't belong to them, and people were told where they could stand. Families stared at piles of rubble that were once their homes. The sun shone through the windows on National Day. Laila entered the bright kitchen in the new bunad Hannah had sewn for her. Papa looked up from his newspaper and gave the broadest smile she had seen from him since the invasion. "My beautiful girl." She was surprised. Her father's unfamiliar words stirred a rare joy. Warmth enveloped her, and for a moment there was no world outside, just her and Papa. She twirled around for him, spreading the pleats of the skirt. He reached out his arms and she skipped over to hug him, wishing this moment would last forever. The rest of the family gathered, dressed in their best clothes. It was National Day and they would celebrate in spite of the occupation. Hannah arrived last, sweeping in, dressed in an emerald green bunad. The bodice trimmed in velvet. Her hips swayed and her skirt swirled. Everyone exclaimed. She was stunning. She looked like a film star. What needlework! So skillful. Laila busied herself with the coffee pot. The women tied aprons over their dresses and prepared the celebration brunch. Officially, National Day had been cancelled, but some Norwegians were still able to take a day off work and honour the day at home with their families. The table was spread with traditional food, smoked salmon, scrambled eggs, and cured ham. Olaf and his cousins rummaged around in wooden boxes, digging out small Norwegian flags on sticks and a string of bunting in national colours. Hannah stood the flags in a stone jug on the table, and Laila and her mother hung the bunting on the kitchen wall. Grandpa was there too, playing folk tunes on his harmonica. Despite his memory lapses, he didn't miss a note. Aunt Kirsten had invited a local family who Laila had known since her childhood. They arrived with a basket of gifts, homemade jams, freshly baked biscuits, and bread. Aunt Kirsten was particularly pleased with the latter, commenting that flour was becoming scarce. Laila wondered what they would eat when their supply of bread ran out. The eldest son of the visiting family was Carl, whom Laila hadn't seen since he had left to study in Oslo. In the 3 years since she had seen him last, he had grown tall, broad and handsome. A memory came of a hot summer day of Carl chasing her and Hannah through long grass to the water's edge. The girls, in matching red swimsuits, had jumped into the cold, clear water, shrieking. Carl had torn off his shirt and, still wearing his trousers, plunged in after them. In a few swift strokes, he had caught up with Laila and wrapped his arms around her. She had noticed that the blonde hair on his forearms had gone dark in the water. He was 15. Now they sat next to each other. He told her about how the Germans had met little resistance when they sailed into Oslo, enabling them to take swift control. There had been little damage to the capital, and under the new regime, daily life had more or less resumed. He was shocked to hear Laila's eyewitness account of the invasion of Narvik and the fierce battle that had ensued. She inquired about his life at university. There had been a time when she'd hoped to study literature, she told him, or languages. She'd enjoyed English and German at school. "I would have liked to become a teacher," she said.
"Really? Most of the teachers I know are men."
"Exactly, but times are changing."
"Why didn't you go on to study?"
"I couldn't leave the family. After Anton."
Laila had decided at an early age that she wanted to be a teacher. She liked children. She'd planned to study at Tromsø Teachers Training College, but after that devastating midsummer's night, Her plans had been sucked into a chasm of grief, as if they'd never existed.
I'm sorry about Anton, said Carl. It's been nearly 2 years, hasn't it?
Laila gave a nod, suddenly aware that Hannah was watching them from across the table. There was a rumble outside. Everyone stopped talking and looked at each other. The switching off of a car engine, the clunk of car doors.
Germans,
said Uncle, peering out the window. Aunt Kirsten snatched the flags from the jug and threw them into the cupboard under the sink. 3 thumps on the door. Laila looked up at the red and blue bunting strung along the wall and half rose to pull it down, but Uncle was already saying good afternoon and stepping aside to allow 2 soldiers to enter the room. Laila's heart jumped. The one with more stripes and metal pinned on his jacket was Major Haas. 2 steps behind him stood Josef, looking solemn. Haas, a slight smirk on his face, spoke.
Please excuse the intrusion. This is a brief visit.
He surveyed the room and studied the food-laden table.
It appears I have disturbed a celebration.
No, said Aunt Kirsten. A normal family meal.
Then you have a large family and an abundance of food in these difficult times.
We grow our own vegetables, and we have a cow, 4 pigs, and 12 chickens.
How enterprising. That is good to know.
He turned to the bunting.
It appears you have made a mistake. The colours displayed on your wall are incorrect.
Silence. Laila's breaths sounded loud in her ears. No one spoke. Major Haas continued to stare at the bunting. Laila cleared her throat. Herr Major Haas, what a coincidence to see you here. Can I offer you something to drink? He ignored her, took 3 swift strides towards the bunting, and tore it down, knocking over a vase as he did so, which broke apart as it hit the floor.
How dare you? Uncle's voice shook. This is my house. I must ask you to leave. Leave?
Haas gave a mock smile, shaking his head.
You don't seem to understand the situation. I am the one who gives the orders here.
He stood in front of Uncle, his heavy frame twice the size.
Not in my home,
said Uncle. Papa moved to stand by his brother-in-law.
Nazis are not welcome here.
Haas's arm catapulted forward, his fist thumping into Papa's stomach. Laila cried out as she watched her father fall to his knees. Haas looked down at him and with a casual flick of his boot sent him sprawling onto his back. A terrible commotion followed. Mama screamed, Josef, his face shocked, stepped forward, and Carl sprang from the table, charging at Haas and struck him on the shoulder. Haas drew his pistol and aimed at Carl's head. Everyone froze. The room fell silent.
You are under arrest for attacking an officer of the Wehrmacht.
He held the gun steady at Carl, giving a swift glance at Josef.
Private Schultz, take this man into custody.
Laila caught Josef's eye. His hesitation was minimal, but Laila saw it before Josef stepped forward and took Carl by the arm. Carl offered no resistance as Josef led him to the door. Haas announced he had merely wanted to deliver a letter to a certain Eva Olsen. He dropped the envelope on the floor beside Papa. Then he wished them all an enjoyable afternoon and left. Anger and hate pulsed through Laila. It was an ugly, powerful emotion she'd never felt before, but at that moment it made her strong. She made a decision. She would fight back, whatever the cost. When Papa had recovered enough, he opened the envelope and slid the letter out, his hand shaking. He read the few lines and looked around the table.
My Volvo has been requisitioned by the Third Reich, but that's hardly important now.
He looked across at Carl's sobbing mother.
All that matters is getting Carl back.
Laila finished work and made her way to the bus stop to meet Papa and Hannah, her mind whirling with the events that had occurred on National Day. It had been a week, and there had been no news of Carl.
It was terrifying to think what may have happened to him. And over again, she thought of Papa on his knees, gasping for breath. Suddenly, an ear-piercing shriek split the air raid siren. All around her, people were running for cover. Her best protection would be to go back to the hotel, to the cellar, but what about Papa and Hannah? They might be already waiting for her. If she ran to meet them, they could all duck down behind the bus station. But that was nowhere near as safe as a cellar. Or they could run to the tailor's shop where Hannah worked and shelter there in the basement. But for Laila, that was further than heading back to the hotel. Bombs fell. Precious moments slipped past. The drone of aircraft approached. A high-pitched whistle. Artillery fire cracked through the air. The noise was behind her and in front of her, and to her left. Something knocked her off her feet, and she dropped to the ground, scraping her hands on loose stones. She was pushed down the grass verge, dipping off to her right, and rolled down the wet slope. She lay on her side as someone rolled next to her, and then over her. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she knew his voice. Josef. Please, God, make this stop, she prayed. He held her tight as explosions shook the ground. She didn't know how long they lay there. And then all went quiet. Josef took his arms from her and sat up. Are you hurt, Fräulein Olsen? For a moment she was too dazed to reply and struggled to sit up. Are you all right, Laila? He asked, his voice full of concern. He had called her Laila. She looked at him. Where did you come from? What happened? I was on my way back to the barracks when the air raid started. You were just standing there. I'm sorry if I hurt you when I pushed you to the ground. She looked at her grass-smeared knees and felt the sting of her grazed palms. I'm fine. I must get to the shop. Her initial relief that the bombing had stopped turned to fear as she noted the silence. What would she find? Had Papa and Hannah been hurt? Or worse? Josef stood and reached out a hand in an offer of help, but she shook her head and scrambled to stand up. Her legs felt weak. As they climbed back up the ditch, she gulped in deep breaths, but the acrid smoke choked her lungs, causing her to cough till her throat was raw. Josef, his voice hoarse, said he would accompany her to meet up with her family. After what happened on National Day, I shouldn't think for one moment that they would want to see you. She strode down the street, yet he continued to walk along beside her. I must sincerely apologize about what happened at your uncle's home. Major Haas's behavior was inexcusable. I'm so sorry about your father. We have been instructed to treat Norwegians with consideration and respect and to maintain good relations. She gave a hard laugh. Haas beat and humiliated my father, and what's happened to Carl? You marched him out of the house. I'm hoping he'll be released. I think I may have been able to persuade Major Haas not to press charges to prevent any further unrest, especially as the event took place in a private home with so many witnesses. It's not an image we want to portray. Really? And what sort of image does Germany want to portray when it invades a country? Josef did not reply, and they hurried on in silence. The town centre had been badly hit, but the small row of buildings with the tailor's shop still stood. Once they were outside the shop, Josef departed. Laila pushed open the door and was met by a stream of people leaving the cellar. The last to come up were Papa and Hannah. They rushed towards her, hugging and crying and thanking God. That evening, the family gathered around Uncle's radio. Germany announced a victorious battle in Narvik and advances in France. Uncle shook his head. The situation has escalated. Narvik is a battle zone. We are all to stay here for the next few days. No one is going to work, said Papa. But the British Navy will beat the Germans, won't they, Papa? Said Olaf. I hope so, but they have their own problems in France. There is one piece of good news, at least, said Uncle. Carl was released unharmed today. Thank God, said Papa, and patted his stomach. And my bruises are fading. But he sure packs a punch, the Major. He gave a wry smile. As Laila drifted off to sleep that night, she thought of Josef's body pressed against hers as the bombs rained down around them.
She thought of his deep voice and the musk of his sweat mixed with the faintest hint of citrus cologne. 5 days later, Laila listened as a BBC newscaster announced that the British had pulled out of Norway and were deploying all troops to Dunkirk. Norway was on its own.
Chapter 3. July to August 1940. Laila cycled past another poster proclaiming the new order under which the Norwegians were instructed to live. She had counted 7 so far. Every tree and lamp-post, it seemed, had a board strapped to it dictating a list of rules and regulations to be followed. Orders of how many people were allowed to gather in one place and for how long. Orders on when people must return home in the evening and when they could leave the house in the morning. Orders dictating which radio station to listen to, what food they could buy, and how much. It was surreal. Turning from the harbour, she cycled down a narrow street between the warehouses. The usual wind tunnel greeted her, and she picked up her pace, her long legs pumping furiously to keep warm in the chill of the early morning. They had been back home in Narvik for 2 weeks following Norway's capitulation. The fighting had stopped. More troops had poured into town, patrolling the streets, and the locals carried on with their lives with pale, stunned faces. The Germans liked to march and sing. Their favourite tune was, "When we go, when we go, when we go to England." Laila liked to imagine them marching into the North Sea and disappearing beneath the waves. Something biblical in that. Their home had survived, but they'd found it in a terrible state. Ash smothered the furniture, floors, and walls. Broken glass lay scattered around, shards embedded in cushions and carpets. Mama was terrified to put baby Inga down anywhere. The whole family toiled to restore order. They swept, washed, and scrubbed. Papa, with help from his friends from the factory, replaced the windows. The next job, planned for the weekend, was to paint the outside of the house. Uncle would bring spare paint he had at the farmhouse. Laila parked her bicycle in the shed at the side of the Hotel Nordic and headed to the entrance. Josef was on duty. She felt suddenly too warm in her wool jacket as she hurried past him, remembering what she'd dreamed last night. Seated at reception, she saw the comings and goings of the officers, heard their German voices, saw their rifles on their shoulders and pistols at their waists. She had enjoyed her job at the busy hotel, greeting the guests, many of whom were merchants involved in shipping fish or iron ore. It was satisfying to keep everything in order, and she liked the staff. But now the sound of boots stomping past jarred her nerves, and she was grateful when it was time to do her rounds with the housekeeper and hand over the reception to another member of staff. The housekeeper, Sigrid, had plenty to say as they walked down the hallway on the first floor, past the chambermaids unloading fresh towels from a trolley.
"How could the king surrender our country? They say he escaped to London."
"I think he had no choice but to surrender," Laila replied. "Our young men were outnumbered and being slaughtered. But King Haakon and the British are supporting the resistance. Help will come. It must." Sigrid opened a room with her master key and cast a glance around. The room was tidy and sparse of belongings. On the narrow desk lay a pack of cigarettes next to a small radio. Laila and Sigrid entered the neighbouring room. Again, there was little of note, except a small picture frame on the bedside table, a black and white photograph of a young woman wearing a large brimmed hat, slightly tilted, and on her arm a small fair-haired boy displaying a gap-toothed grin. The sight of the picture made Laila's stomach churn, but she couldn't identify why. Most of the staff ate in the kitchen, but Laila, the manager, and Sigrid had been allocated a small table in the corner of the restaurant where the officers ate. Laila liked to eat alone whilst looking at a book that she lay open in front of her. She occasionally turned a page as if reading, but in reality she was straining to hear the officers' conversations, eager to hear anything that might be useful. Hopefully they would underestimate her knowledge of German and sooner or later let something important slip. If she gleaned any information,
she would speak to her best friend Oda, who'd said her brother Finn wanted to get involved in resistance. The picture of Papa on his knees haunted her, but also made her determined. She would use her position at the hotel to do something meaningful for her country. Although she'd heard nothing of interest from the officers that day, she decided to visit Oda anyway. As she walked to see Oda after work, she spotted a giant iron ore freighter at the harbour being loaded with a supply that had just arrived from Kiruna, Sweden. Laila perched on a low wall to watch and sighed. More ore heading for Germany for weapon manufacture. But it would be a perilous journey for the freighter. The British had mined the North Sea. That's why Hitler was planning to extend the rail network. Was there no stopping the man? There must be a way. A group of loud young men who had been milling around began to jeer. Laila turned to see what they were angry at and saw two familiar faces approaching. Josef and another guard from the hotel, who she had heard Josef call Heinz. The gathered men threw out taunts in Norwegian. Josef's face remained calm, but Heinz set his jaw. His eyes narrowed. One of the men, who looked to be aged around 16 years old, pushed himself forward, swayed for a moment, and then pulled firmly on his cap. "Looks like trouble's coming," said Heinz in a sing-song voice. "He's just a boy who's had too much to drink," said Josef. "Let's avoid a confrontation." At that moment, he noticed Laila. He gave her a concerned look, and she instinctively moved a few steps away from the impending brawl. The boy staggered up to the soldiers. Josef smiled and nodded. "Guten Tag." Heinz, at Josef's side, stood rigid, his fists clenched. The boy slurred some more Norwegian abuse and then spat out, "Deutsche Schweine." Heinz shot at him like a cannonball, smashing him in the face with astonishing fury. Laila gasped. Josef sprang forward, trying to restrain Heinz as he pummeled the young boy to the ground. The boy screamed, blood spurting from his nose. Josef wrestled with Heinz, shouting at him to stop, and managed to drag the two apart. Within moments, other soldiers appeared with raised guns and surrounded the group. Josef hoisted up the semi-conscious, blood-covered boy, and with an arm under his shoulders, led him away from the pier. As he passed Laila, their eyes locked. She saw him acknowledge her horror, and she saw how he hated this moment, and how he hated the uniform he wore. Oda and Laila had been best friends at school. In summertime, they would spend afternoons lying amongst the wild flowers, talking about family, teachers, and books. They both loved to read. On dark winter days, they would huddle in blankets on Oda's bed and talk for hours about the changes in their bodies, their friends, and boys. Oda was always more knowledgeable than Laila about boys. She often said Laila was too prim. Today, in the bookshop, the friends chatted, catching up on news as Oda removed books from shelves and set up a new display on a small round table.
"We've had a rush on everything Norwegian, history, culture and folklore, so I'm presenting a selection near the front of the shop."
"Great idea," said Laila, picking up a book about the artist Edvard Munch. "Hopefully you won't be forbidden from selling them."
"Who knows what will come next, but for now it's business as usual."
Oda stood back to appraise her display. Laila looked around her and lowered her voice. "Oda, you mentioned something about Finn being involved," she said, her pulse quickening. "My position at the hotel could help."
"Not now. Come to my house on Thursday evening and we can talk."
Laila felt a shiver of anticipation. The townsfolk called them the White Nights, when the long, cold gloom of winter succumbed to the endless days and people were beset with insomnia and agitation. Each night, Laila lay frenzied by thoughts of ways to fight back against the German occupiers. But there was something else that the White Nights weaved into Laila's consciousness. Yearning. At night, when she was hot and her skin damp, she tore off her nightdress and lay naked on her bed, spinning dreams. Images of Josef rose unbeckoned and swirled in her head. Guilt gnawed at her when she thought of him,
and she tried to blank him out with plans of revenge against the Germans, but still he stirred something in her that she fought to ignore. And behind her blackout blind, the silver-white light strayed till dawn. One evening in August, after a dinner of salted herring and potatoes, Laila and Hannah walked down to the harbour to enjoy the light summer evening. At least curfew was later this time of year, and the blackout blinds could stay open longer. The sisters looked out across the harbour, a brisk wind tugging at their skirts. The fjord was littered with wrecks of ships and boats from the recent battles. A German destroyer lay flipped on its side, half submerged like a dead whale. The debris of supply ships and iron ore transporters was scattered around the port, masts and funnels protruding from the waves, macabre shapes against a navy blue sky. Fishing boats negotiated their way through slicks of cloying oil, heading for home ahead of curfew. Laila turned away from the devastation. "Let's walk further out from town." They stopped again further down the coast at an outcrop of large, flat rocks, where they sat on the sun-warmed stone. Their legs straight out in front of them, their skirts clamped between their knees. They watched in silence as orange-billed oystercatchers shrieked and dived for mussels and tiny crabs amongst the rocks. The sky dimmed to a deep purple, releasing a copper sun into the waves. Laila sighed. She couldn't imagine living anywhere else other than Norway. Papa's older brother had emigrated to America 20 years ago. America. So far, strange and different. The idea had never appealed to her. In the lull of the wind, snatches of voices floated through the air. Laila and Hannah edged forward on the boulder and peered down. Some way beneath them, a couple sat, holding hands. Laila recognized the girl, Marion. She had been in her class at school. Marion was leaning on the man's shoulder. He wore the uniform of a German soldier. Fascinated, Laila and Hannah watched the couple as they chatted and then embraced, their kisses becoming increasingly passionate. Laila began to feel uncomfortable and nudged Hannah. "Let's go." "It's just not right," said Laila as they headed for home. "How could Marion start something with a German?" She thought of Josef, and claws of guilt tore at her insides. "Marion has always been a bit of a flirt," said Hannah, laughing. "And the soldiers have only been here 3 months. Flirting is one thing, but with a German, we've enough young Norwegian men in this town." "But maybe Marion thinks they're not as attractive as those clean-cut, well-built young soldiers in their smart new uniforms." Laila gave Hannah a sharp look.